السلام علیکم بینندگان عزیز. امیدوار هستم که در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. امروز در برنامه ما داریم اورنسا جان فریاد. امروز ما هستن از شهر ویرجینیا از Adam Center. Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly programming on Sadai Haq Television. We are so delighted to have our monthly visitor, Huri Jan, who comes to us from the Adam Center. We're going to have a very insightful conversation about the effects and impacts of the second wave of COVID, elderly isolation, and really how people are feeling during the holidays. چون در وقت مورد کرونا دفعه دوم است که دوره کرده و خیلی مهم بود که راجع به زو صحبت کنیم. نه تنها کرونا پس آمده اما همچنان این دفعه آل وقت که آمده که رخصتی هستن و عموما هر کس امرایی که دیگه خود رفت آمد می داشته باشه یا هر جای میرن. از اون خاطر میخواستیم که کمک راجع به زی صحبت کنیم. Hurunnessa Jan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Assalamualaikum. How are you, Hurunnessa Jan? So nice to be back here with you on our monthly segments.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to see how you were doing, how the community that you serve was doing. Perhaps we can start a little bit there and kind of talk about the definition of coping, right? Like, what is coping? I know that there is a little translation for it, but also there are different types of coping. And I think that it's really important to touch on that particular point, especially during this time of year. می‌خواستیم که راجع به تحمل کردن صحبت کنیم. تحمل کردن چی معنا میده؟ مخصوصاً در وقت کرونا.
So the community is here, just like everywhere else in the United States and all over the world, coping with what COVID has brought to us now this year. I think the most important thing right now is to focus on how we're going to get past the next couple of months during the holidays and with the COVID numbers going up. And that's something that we really need to hone in on because it's going to affect so many people on so many different levels. For instance, we have our elderly community that we're going to talk about as well, and the people who are living alone. Right now with the masjids, some of them are open for some of the prayers, not all the prayers. Some of them are actually having cases of COVID at the masjids as well. So what does that mean? How are we going to handle that? And tell people, sorry, you can't come to the masjid again. I kind of knew that was going to happen after Thanksgiving with the flu season being here, with people's immune system going down. If they're sick, if they're immunosuppressant, that's going to be another issue. And people traveling more. I think right around Thanksgiving holiday, the travel has been the most since COVID started. And that's alarming. And that's actually quite scary because that's how it's going to transfer from one person to another. So I'm not sure that traveling during Thanksgiving and the holidays is a smart idea. I know we miss our families. I know it's going to be really difficult, but we really need to think about our safety and the safety of others.
Absolutely. And our programming is designed to include people who speak Dari and people who speak English so that we're going to try to incorporate and go back and forth between the two languages.
اینا لمی نفرایی که اینجا در ویرجینیا یا در امریکا هستن کلی بسیار در یک وقت بسیار سخت ما پیش آمده و ما میخوایم که کلگی را بگوییم که بهتر است که در خانه تان باشین، بیرون نرین. جت نیست میاله که چرا که هالیدی است و نفر از کار خود آف گرفته باشه یا اشتکا از مکتب آف هستن که ما اینالی وقت بگیریم و بریم سفر کنیم در خانه یک کس دیگه بریم، چون که کووید بسیار خطرناک است هنوزم، خصوصا در این وقتی که حال زمستان است. ایمیون سیستم کلگی یک ذره فرق میکنه چون که فلو سیزن هم است و نفرهایی که خودشان وقت مریض هستن بر از خطرناک است مگر خطرناکتر است بر از اونا، چون که زندگیشان برشان بسیار کووید برشان بسیار خطرناک است که مو اینفکشن و چیزایی که در بدنشان است از طرف کووید برشان یک چیز است که نجات شاید نتونن بگیرن. و ما در مسجد ما فعلا ما نماز را میتیم مگر نفر بسیار کم است. ما در نماز جمعه 50 نفر میمانیم که بیاییم و کلشان باید رجیستر کنن پیش ازی که بیاین اما آدرسشان تلفن نمبرشان کلشان باید در آنلاین رجیستر کنن و این از خاطر میکنیم که کانتکت تریسینگ باشه که نفرایی که میاین در جمعه ما میفهمیم که کی هسته و اگر یک کس بر ما بگه که ما خودم کووید گرفتیم ما میتونیم کنیم نفرایی که در جمعه آمده باشن او را تلفن کنیم یا ایمیل کنیم که یک نفر آمد اینجا که کووید خودتان تست کنیم. یک مشهد دیگر دمی دور بر ما اتنا میکرد هر کسی که میخواست که بیاید بر نماز جمعه میماندن که بیاین. انال تقریبا 30 نفر کووید گرفت یک هفته پیش. انال تو بفهم من کی را تلفن کنن دکی میخبرن بتن که کووید در مسجد بود نفرایی که کووید داشتن آمده بودن. از این خاطر مهمتر است که آدم خودش خود نگاه کنه فامیل خود نگاه کنه بهتر است که در خانه بشینه چون که آدم نمیفهمه که از کجا میگیره و در کدام وقت. از خاطر دمی وقتی که حال زمستان است بهتر است که ما دمی در فکر ما بگیریم.
100%. Thank you so much for the insight as far as the masajids go, because it's interesting that you brought this up. Yesterday, I was driving through this area, which is my masjid, which is the NBIC, North Brunswick Islamic Center in New Jersey. And when I was going down that path, which I have been avoiding for such a long time, I started to feel very emotional. And I started to remember how this is and was such a place of solace for me, a place where I sought refuge, amazing programming that this facility has for families, and not just on an individual basis. Yes, because that's what kind of when you're going through things, some people do turn to their faith and do turn to that as comfort. And I felt this incredible amount of just a somber feeling that I know that if I was ever in that neighborhood, I would definitely stop by, say hello, do a prayer, or take part in the activities, or bring my children. And I feel like that's a really huge part of our lives that's been lacking. You're fortunate enough to be part of this great institution that you're working there and you're within. But I feel like congregation members who do not necessarily feel comfortable entering a masjid at this time, it's very difficult. That was the first point that I wanted to make. The second point that I wanted to make was that contact tracing is so incredibly important. Even yes, with restaurants and places of worship and places that we visit, but even so, what we have in our family is that we have a system internally. So for example, if I know that I'm only going to be in touch with 2 members of my family, we notify each other if we've gone outside of that bubble. If they're allowed to come over and we're allowed to come over. But if somebody else, a third person, were to come in, then at that point, one of us would let the other person know that somebody else has entered. These are the people. This is the date. So we're actually doing contact tracing within our own home. Right. And I know that New York has, especially in the borough in which I live in, the levels and the numbers have spiked enormously. And for some reason, people were so scared and people were taking so many precautions in March. And now it feels like it's the opposite. I hardly see people with masks. I don't see people doing social distancing. Yesterday when I was driving by one of our really big malls, the lines and the amount of law enforcement that I saw outside, arguably more than I saw last year, which is very, very alarming. که امی از نگاه مسجد که هسته اگه آدم در مسجد کار نکنه و فقط در روزهای جمعه بره یا در روزهایی که یک پروگرام باشه یا بر نماز بره، یک آرامش انسان احساس میکنه. و دین روز دیر شدم از شروع مسجد خود و بسیار متاثر شدم برای از اینکه اون جایی که اولادا خوش بودن، میتونیم که دین خدا یاد بگیریم، میتونیم که امرای کمیونیتی خود یک جای باشیم، چی که مهم باید رمضان باشه، چی که روز جمعه باشه. بسیار زیاد متاثر شدم که متاسفانه هنوزم نمیتونیم که مثل سابق باره اونجا بریم و عبادت خدا پیش ببریم. و دوم چیزی که میخواستم راجع بهش صحبت کنم است کانتکت تریسینگ. هرونسا جان گفت که بسیار یک چیز مهم است که وقتی آدم در مسجد میره یا در رستوران میره یا در هر جای پابلیک میری، باید از یک فرم را خانه پولی کنی نامادر است برای از اینکه اگر کسی کرونا خدای نخواسته بگیرش شما را اول بده که اکسپوز شده. ما در خانه خودم این کار میکنیم. دمی 2 فامیل یا 3 فامیل که رفت آمد داریم، ما یادداشت میکنیم. اگر یک کس دیگه داخل خانه فامیل ما بیاید و بر ما اول میدن. و به خاطر چی؟ به خاطر از اینکه اگر خدای نخواسته یک نفر هم بگیره، ما بفهمیم که از پیش کی گرفتیم و چی هم اکسپوز شدیم. بسیار مهم است که در خانه تان امی رواج پیش ببرین اگر امکاناتش باشه. Hurunnessa, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to point out that a lot of times people are eager to go to the masjid, and of course, you know, me working as one, it's something that is embedded in my daily schedule. But you know, our executive imam, who is the highest executive religious authority in our masjid, said, you know, close down the masjid because your life is more important. You don't need to come for prayer. You can pray at home, and it counts as if you were praying at the masjid. ما در مسجد خودم کار میکنم و می امام کلان مسجد ما خودشان دمی لیدرشپ مسجد گفتن که مسجد بند کنین، کلگی در خانه نماز خدا خوانده میتونه. اونمو برکت که میگرفتین برای میامده وقتی که میامدین در مسجد نماز میخوانین، اونمو مساوی است که اگر درون خانه تان بخوانین، حاجت نیست که بیاین در مسجد رو بخوانین، چون که وقت است که زندگی مهمتر است از اینکه بیاین در مسجد نماز بخوانین. از خاطر ما باید امی زندگی رو پرکتیکلی سعی کنیم که امی اسلام اصلا چی میگه دمی باره، و مهمتر است که ما نماز جمعه در مسجد بخوانیم که کلگی یا زندگی ما را نجات بگیریم ازش و برای کلگی دیگه. از خاطر مهم است که از باری از این چیزا گپ بزنیم.
I mean, I think the beauty of Islam and the perfection of Islam lies within the theory of do whatever is easier, right? Take the easiest route. Do what is going to be practical and best for you. I mean,
right, but then even then people argue with that because they have their own perception and their own interpretation of it. But as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if there's a plague somewhere in your city, don't leave. And if there's a plague somewhere else in another city, don't enter it. I mean, this was over 1400 years ago, and it's common sense that, you know, our faith would address it. I hope people would take heed to that. یکانه حدیث پیغمبر محمد صلی الله علیه و سلم ما است که گفتن اگر در یک شهر یک مریضی باشه و شما در شهر باشین، از اون نبراین، و اگر در یک شهر دیگه کدام مریضی باشه شما خودتون در اونجا نرین. این یگانه چیز است که اسلام خودش وقت بر ما میگه که چه قسم می زندگی خود پیش ببریم. اما تو چیزا اگر در پیش روی ما بیاید ما چه قسم کدش دیل کنیم و در این سون برین یا در اون سون برین. در شریعت اسلامی چیزا وقت گفتگی شده. شما باید از این باره فکر نکنیم که نماز ما قبول نمیشه و ما گناه میکنیم. این وقت بسیار دیگه قسم است، وقت عادی نیست. از اون خاطر ما باید در یک فکر دیگه باید پیش ببریم زندگی خدا در این وقت.
Right, and also there are exceptions to rules that are made, especially in Islam, right? Nothing is black and white, and nothing is so concrete that there's no understanding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all merciful, all forgiving. You know, obviously a pandemic is not something that anybody else has ever lived through in our lifetime to be able to experience this. And this is a great segue into another thing that I wanted to talk about, which was the taboos that kind of come with all of the things. There's everything that's going on with COVID, everything that's going on with not being able to see your family during the holidays, etc. But then there's like the way you were brought up, right? Then there's these Afghan, these things, some things that I've heard. I'll throw them out there, like خدا هیچ امکان نداره که نماز جمعه خب فرض است. هیچ امکان نداره که ایده خب کلگی میفهمه که این فرض است, right? So just to translate English, it's like, unfortunately, there's always going to be that group of people where, I mean, I remember when our masjid was shut down, and the first Friday that our masjid was shut down, there was a line of people outside, practically up in arms. What do you mean the masjid is not open? Wow. This was before it became a national thing. This was when masjids were making decisions on their own of whether or not they should remain open. And because we had such high levels, we decided to close, and it was a very, very controversial decision. And, I wish that we would open up our minds as a community and understand that this is a very, very exceptional time.
Yeah, and even this idea of how Islam treats these types of incidents, it's a coping mechanism, right? That's given. How are you going to cope in this time of a pandemic when you're supposed to be isolated and not touch people until things get better? And so Islam addresses that also, right? By telling us that your life is way more important than your prayer in congregation. Do your prayers at home and you get the same hasanat as you would if you were praying in the masjid. So the topic of our discussion today is this idea of coping mechanisms and coping with issues and stress and things that are really troubling us at a time. And we're at that point right now with COVID affecting our daily life. So we need to learn how to do things properly. در شریعت اسلام خودش کوپینگ مکانیزم و یگانه چیز است که بر ما وقت گفتگی شده نه دمی وقت پندمیک کووید خانه بشینیم که یکی دیگه خود ایسولیت کنیم که دیگرها بیرون نریم در دکانا که میریم ماسک بپوشیم خود هند سانیتایزر استفاده کنیم دستای خود بشوییم کدام چیزا در اسلام خودش وقت میگه که چون ما میفهمیم که در شریعت اسلام زندگی بسیار یک چیز مهم است که ما باید کل کاری که باید بتانیم که می زندگی را پیش ببریم باید بکنیم و اگر ما وقت میخواستیم که مسجد بریم و فکر میکنیم که یک نماز در مسجد چیز میشه و الله سبحانه تعالی سرمقار میشه اگر ما مسجد نریم این در وقت پندمیک مهم نیست چون که در وقت پندمیک اونمون نماز که شما در ظهر نمازه که در خانه میخونین اونمو حسنت که در خانه میخونین اونمو مساوی است که اگر شما در مسجد میرفتین. خب ما باید همین چیزا رو بفهمیم و فکر نکنیم که دین ما از پیش ما میره یا ما خراب هستیم یا بسیار یک کار خراب است که مسجد سر ما کدایش که ما نمیتونیم نماز در مسجد بخونیم.
So, I was thinking about when we were discussing this, kind of coming up with this topic and tips about coping. One of the things that came to mind, or a couple of things that came to mind, was preparedness, routine, and open communication. یک سه چیزی که در فکر ما اومد که وقتی که فکر میکردم که چی رقم آدم آمادگی خود بگیره برای این second wave of COVID، یک سه چیز در حافظه ما اومد. اول از این که آمادگی. هر انسانی که در فامیل خود یا در خانه خود آمادگی داشته باشه بهتر می باشه. اول دفعه که کووید آمد آمادگی نبود and that's why there was no toilet paper left, right? So, I mean, it's a silly example, but it holds a lot of truth to it. دوم از این که باید هر انسان یک تقسیم اوقات داشته باشه که او را باید است که از صبح تا شام مخصوصا برای طفل خود و اولاد خود اسکیجول داشته باشه که چی رقم روز خود و شب خود تیر کنه. I think it's really important to stick to routine. Routine is an incredible important thing from a psychological point of view that keeps people on track that keeps people focused, that keeps people, gives them sense of purpose, which is something that I have discovered in the last 9 months. I can't believe that it's been 9 months. Um, I had a lot of the clients that I've been speaking to really uh, are suffering. And part of the reason why they're suffering is because they've lost sense of purpose, whether it's losing their job, having a pay cut or a role cut, which is the new thing, right? Like, let me give you less of responsibility. If you were working full time 40 hours, now you're going to be doing 20 hours. So there's been a lot of big life changes. And according to studies, mental health disorders and domestic issues have gone up 500%. یک چیز بسیار جالبی که میخواستم شما را هم شریک بسازم که 500% تکلیف های اعصاب بلند رفته، 500% مشکلات که در خانواده می بود بلند رفته و همچنان نفرهایی که وظیفهشان وقتشان کم شده، معاششان آیدشان کم شده، خیلی سرشان تاثیر کرده و بسیار مهم است که یک راه حل پیدا شود. There has to be a solution, which leads me to the last thing that I could come up with. And of course, Hurijan, I would love to hear some tips that you came up with and some reflection on this, is the open lines of communication. I know mental health providers right now that are seeking and receiving mental health treatment. And that doesn't mean that the provider has gone crazy. That doesn't mean that. It just means that there is like this linear effect that's taken place. So there's no hierarchy anymore. You're my patient. We don't like to use the word patient, but we don't use client, even individual. You're the individual that I'm serving. That would be the correct verbiage. So you are the individual that I'm serving. What's going on with you? Now the rules are all, everything has been, it's like we're all the same, right? Like, so today I went through this. What did you go through? Right? Like this week has been tough because, so it's interesting in a lot of ways, but also very, very important. I've been reading a lot of news articles that have been talking about medical professionals taking their lives and people that are on the front lines really suffering. بسیار رنج غم زیاد شده امروی دکترها، نرسا، روانشناسا، برای از اینکه همیشه 24 ساعت کووید میبینن و مردم میبینن که میمورن و خیلی سر اعصابشون تاثیر کرده و مهم است که اگه بیخی دکترم باشی، نرسم باشی، هنوزم پیش یک روانشناس برین، گپ بزنید، صحبت کنید.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of great topics and strategies to use in the home and with your family and friends to understand exactly what's going on. And then there are also other coping mechanisms that we can use to make ourselves center back within ourselves. For instance, exercising, making sure that we're taking care of our body, drinking enough water, meditating, playing games. That's always, like it just sounds like a fun thing to do. But these all are different positive strategies that we can use to cope with our stress and our, trauma that some people are going through at this time with COVID. And taking care of ourselves, our mental health, our physical health is key in being able to move on. Because if our body is not in line with where it needs to be and our, mental and emotional capacities are not in line, it's going to affect on how we actually counteract the other issues that are coming in our lives. For instance, if we lose a job, if we're already mentally down, if we're already not exercising, or not getting our blood circulating in the right places, it's going to affect us even more. So it's important to keep everything in line, regardless of what happens in life. Things that we don't have control, we do have control over what we're doing to ourselves. And that's key in this whole thing of coping and making sure that we're surrounded by positivity. Loneliness is going to be an issue during this time. So one of the coping mechanism is Zoom and getting online or FaceTiming with your friends and family. You can't be there, you can't touch them, but at least you have a way of communicating with them and seeing them. And then also working on our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This COVID thing did not happen randomly for no reason. Right, we've been so busy with our lives and running around trying to make money, build our career, raise our families, that sometimes we forget to have that connection with God. So this is really an important way of having that connection. یگانه وقت است که کووید که ما خود ما فکر کنیم که الله سبحانه تعالی یمی مرض آمده، در این وقت بسیار مهم است که ما فکر کنیم و در زندگی ما پیش ببریم که می ریلیشنشیپ خود ما که الله سبحانه تعالی در این وقت مهمتر باید باشه و ما باید کوشش کنیم که نزدیکتر شویم برای که الله سبحانه تعالی. because در وقت ما خانه هستیم، کار خودم از خانه میکنیم، اولادای ما، فامیل ما کلشان در خانه هستن و یک اپورتونیتی است که ما امو کنکشن که الله سبحانه تعالی یک ذره بهتر جور کنیم. کوپینگ مکانیزمز که ما هر روز که من خودم کوشش میکنم که در زندگی خودم باشه و یگانه چیز است که ورزش کنم، برم بیرون، قدم بزنم، بدوم. آنلاین کورسز هم هست که کلشان فری است در یوتیوب. ماده میتونین اکسرسایز کنین، یوگا، استرنگ ترینینگ، بدنتان نگاه کنین. اینم باز برای اعصابتان. برین که دوستایتان گپ بزنین یا امو چای که بسیار خوش دارین نوره بنوشین یا امو چیزایی که برتان خوشی میاره و امی اعصابتان آرام میکنه و امو چیزا را باید بکنین که اگر اعصاب و بدن و جسمتان خودش در جای خوب نباشه، وقتی که زندگی یک پرابلم برتان پیش میاره، امو افکتش سرتان زیادتر می باشه و اگر چیزایتان آرام، امو اعصابتان آرام باشه و بدنتان در یک جای خوب باشه، امو پرابلم که میایه شما خودتان میفهمیم که امو پرابلم از بارش زیاد فکر نمیکنین و سرتان زیادتر تاثیر هم نمیکنه. و این مهم است که ما باید کل چیزا فکر کنیم، اعصاب خود باید فکر کنیم، از باره بدن خود، از باره دور بار ما کی است کی نیست، کی بر ما خوب است در وقت و میفهمیم که